Hey guys, tonight we travel through the haze of myth and into the soft hum of history, where smoke curls above grassy plains and hooves thunder in the distance. You stand on an open steppe, somewhere near the Black Sea, the sky a bruised purple as twilight settles in. The air smells like sweat, campfires, and horse leather. You can almost hear the clink of bronze and the taut twang of a bowstring being drawn. This is where the story of the real Amazons might begin, not in temples or scrolls, but on horseback, in the fierce freedom of the Eurasian steppes. There's no golden lasso yet, just grit, skill, and survival. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your location and what time it is where you're listening from. Let's see who else is joining this midnight ride. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge through the tall grass, careful not to trip on rabbit holes or the occasional leftover spear shaft sticking up from the earth. This is Scythian territory, wild, vast, and unforgiving. A place where mobility matters more than walls, where survival demands speed, strength, and knowing where to find water before your enemies, or worse, your own camel collapses. And nestled among these bands of mounted warriors are women, not just tending fires or raising children, though they do that too. No, some of them are out there, shoulder to shoulder with men, firing arrows from horseback, ambushing enemies, and charging headfirst into chaos. You imagine one now, her hair braided tight, cheeks wine-burned, a bow slung across her back, and a dagger tucked into her boot. She's probably eyeing you suspiciously. You'd look suspicious too, showing up in sneakers and a hoodie, staring at her like she's a cosplay character. But she's very real, or at least, she was. Historians believe that the women who inspired Amazon myths may have come from nomadic tribes like the Scythians, who roamed this region from around the 9th century BCE. These tribes didn't live in cities or build pyramids. They left behind few monuments, but they left something much more revealing: tombs, or more specifically, Kurgan's large burial mounds filled with grave goods that give us a peek into their world. One of the most striking things about these tombs, a surprising number of them belong to women buried with weapons, swords, arrows, armor, some even with war injuries. That's not just someone's great aunt who happened to own a spear for decoration. That's a warrior, possibly even a leader. And suddenly, the legends of the Amazons don't seem so legendary anymore. Back in ancient Greece, the Amazons were described as a race of fierce, all-female warriors who lived on the fringes of the known world, always just a little out of reach. They were exotic, dangerous, and of course, a bit confusing to the average Greek philosopher. I mean, women who choose battle over babies. That really rattled the toga crowd. But here on the steppe, it isn't a political statement. It's necessity. Everyone rides, everyone fights. The gender roles that seemed so rigid back in marble-columned Athens feel blurrier here. And let's not pretend life was any easier. You try sleeping in a felt yurt when it's minus 20 degrees and the wind's howling like an angry banshee. You try aiming a bow from the back of a galloping horse without dislocating your shoulder. These women weren't just tough, they were tactical, mobile warfare specialists, possibly even strategists who could outthink and outride many male armies of their time. Still, historians argue whether these warrior women were truly common, or just a standout few. Some say the bones don't lie, others insist the story's still fuzzy. But what's clear is this: the Greeks were not making everything up. They were just interpreting it with a heavy dose of melodrama. Like that one guy in the group chat who turns every road trip into an epic saga. And speaking of sagas, the Greeks weren't the only ones watching. Later Persians, Romans, even the Chinese had their own versions of wild warrior women. But here, in this grassy sea near the Black Sea, we find the first embers of the Amazon story. The terrain is perfect for myth-making, Endless horizons, sudden mists. One moment you see a silhouette on the ridge, next it's gone. Maybe it was a rider, maybe it was a ghost. Or maybe just your imagination turning wind and twilight into legend. As the sun dips lower, the sky fading to dark indigo, you hear laughter and shouting from a nearby camp. It's a mix of voices, high and low, men and women, blending into the sounds of crackling fires and horses shifting in their sleep. You crouch down by the firelight, warming your hands, and watch as a woman sharpens a blade, her eyes flicking upward now and then. She's calm, experienced, like she's done this 100 times before and probably has. You wonder what she dreams about. Peace, maybe, or perhaps glory in battle. Or just getting through another winter without frostbite in uncomfortable places. One quirky find unearthed from this region was a pouch full of cannabis near a woman's grave, possibly used as part of rituals, or for pain relief, or maybe just because sometimes life on the steppe calls for a vibe shift. It's in these human details, ashes in a hearth, worn leather gloves, that odd tattoo ink residue, that the Amazons become more than myth. They become real people, tough, flawed, clever, and utterly remarkable. And just like that, you're no longer looking at shadowy legends. You're sitting beside warriors, some with missing teeth, others with crooked noses from old brawls, sharing stew, stories, and survival tips. You can't help but smile. You'd absolutely die in a day out here, but it's nice to pretend you'd at least look cool doing it. The sun rises slowly over the Scythian plains, flooding everything in gold. It doesn't warm much, it's still cold enough to make your breath puff out like a baby dragon's sigh, but it brings just enough light to see the dust glinting in the air. You hear hoofbeats before you see them. A dozen riders thunder past on shaggy horses, their cloaks streaming, their braids bouncing. Most are young, all are armed, and yet at least half of them are women. You follow their trail to the edge of a temporary camp, the kind that springs up overnight like a desert flower and vanishes again by evening. This is life on the move, nothing permanent, everything portable. Tents, tools, weapons, even stories, all passed hand to hand, generation to generation, across the endless plains. In the center of camp, a young woman crouches beside a blackened pot, stirring something that smells suspiciously like fermented mare's milk. Delicious, probably. She's dressed for war, but not the kind you'd expect. No gleaming armor or plumed helmets here. Instead, trousers, practical, well-worn, flexible. Trousers, in fact, may have been invented or at least popularized by these nomadic cultures, and they weren't just a fashion statement. You try straddling a galloping horse while wearing a toga. Yeah, no thanks. What's fascinating is how the practical design of their clothes tells you almost everything about their way of life. This wasn't a culture of ornate robes and leisurely banquets. It was about agility, function, and adapting to an environment that didn't care one bit if you were hungry, cold, or culturally offended by snow in May. And then there's the weaponry. You get a close look at the legendary Scythian composite bow, sleek, deadly curve of wood, horn, and sinew. It's smaller than the kind you'd see in Europe, which makes it perfect for shooting from horseback. And yes, women wielded them just as effectively as men. Some skeletons buried with bows even show muscular development in the shoulders and arms, the kind of bone stress you get from a lifetime of archery. So, yeah, that ain't your grandma's knitting cramp. Still, historians argue whether those bows were meant for battlefield heroism or more day-to-day survival, hunting, defense, showing off at tribal fairs. But one thing is certain, these women were skilled, and their weapons weren't ceremonial. These weren't wall hangers, they were lifesavers. Even the horses tell a story. Not big show ponies or armored war beasts, but smaller, stocky steppe ponies, sturdy, loyal, and weirdly expressive. You see one right now, blinking at you like it's sizing up your worth as a pack animal. Don't take it personally, you're probably not its type. A curious girl no older than 12 walks past leading her own horse. She's wearing a quiver, and the way she handles the animal tells you this isn't some weekend riding lesson. She's training, not for sport, for life. It's possible, scholars believe, that girls in these societies began combat training young, learning to ride, shoot, and survive before they could spell their own names, assuming they had a written language at all, which, fun fact, many didn't. And yet, their material culture, the artifacts left behind, is rich with meaning. Carved bone mirrors, engraved belt buckles, delicate gold earrings. Items both beautiful and brutal, because these were people who lived in a world where both coexisted daily. You can imagine a warrior woman checking her reflection in polished bronze before heading into battle. Gotta look fierce and fabulous, after all. One fringe theory, brace yourself, is that some of these women may have intentionally altered their bodies for war. The old Greek myth says Amazons cut off a breast to shoot better, but don't worry, that's likely just classical era mansplaining. No archaeological evidence supports it. But still, the idea that Greeks came up with that detail tells you something about how disturbed they were by the idea of women with better aim than them. Back at the camp, the riders return, dusty, tired, satisfied. A hunt, a skirmish, you're not sure. But the air crackles with shared energy, like electricity running along a braided wire of camaraderie and adrenaline. One woman dismounts, tosses her reins to a boy barely out of toddlerhood, and drops her bow with the casual confidence of someone who knows exactly who she is. You watch her stride across the camp, laughing, talking, stretching out sore muscles beneath a sky that still hasn't made up its mind about the weather. She's not a myth. She's muscle and motion. And she's not the only one. And as for men, they're here too. Scythian society wasn't a reverse patriarchy, and it wasn't a feminist utopia either. More like a culture where everyone pulled their weight or risked pulling nothing at all. Warrior women didn't replace men, they fought alongside them, partners, siblings, rivals. In some graves, husbands and wives are buried side by side, both with weapons. Equality through hardship, not philosophy. Historians still argue whether Scythian women had formalized military roles, or if combat was a sometimes thing like when your camp got raided and everybody grabbed the sharpest thing nearby. But the evidence keeps piling up. This wasn't a fluke, it was a pattern. One quirky tidbit: some women were buried with mirrors that doubled as signaling devices, polished so finely they could reflect the sun over long distances. Ancient text messages, if you will accept, with more squinting and fewer emojis. You sit by a dwindling fire now, belly full of roasted root vegetables and slightly suspect goat cheese. The stars overhead are shockingly clear. A woman nearby sharpens her arrowheads with methodical patience. You don't need words to understand her routine. Survival is art here. Repetition, practice, discipline. And as the wind picks up, bringing the scent of cold and the hint of snow, you pull your blanket tighter around you. These women didn't just survive, they thrived in a landscape that ate the weak. No thrones, no castles, no tiaras, just grit, hooves, and the quiet creak of leather saddles at dawn. You hear a low whistle from the edge of camp. It's a signal, not urgent, just a reminder, somewhere out there, the horizon is watching. And if danger comes, they'll be ready. You're definitely not ready. But you're here, and for now, that's enough. You squint through the dusty glare of the midday sun, wondering what that noise is. Someone laughing, chanting. No, it's a voice. Gravelly, dramatic, and unmistakably Greek. You turn to find an elderly man perched on a rock, a scroll in one hand and a very self-satisfied grin on his face. "Let me tell you," he says, waving the scroll, "about the wildest women to ever swing a sword." Herodotus lived in the 5th century BCE and wrote histories, a sprawling account of the known world that's equal parts fact, fiction, and I swear my cousin's friend told me this happened, somewhere between documenting Persian invasions and Babylonian hangouts. he introduces the Scythians and their fiery, female fighters. According to him, the Amazons were a tribe of warrior women who fought the Greeks at Troy, got shipwrecked in the Black Sea, and eventually mated with Scythian men to create a whole new people. You know, just a quiet Tuesday. He doesn't hold back with the details either. These women, he claims, didn't do any woolworking or house chores. They hunted, rode horses, and refused to marry until they'd killed a man in battle. Subtle? No. Herodotus probably heard that and did a dramatic spit take with his olive oil. Now, is any of that true? Historians still argue whether Herodotus' version of the Amazon origin story was based on real interactions with nomadic tribes or just campfire tales taken way too literally. But it's fascinating how he chose to frame these women: exotic, dangerous, hyper-competent, and, of course, slightly terrifying to every tunic-wearing Athenian. You glance back at the real Scythian camp you just visited. There were no magical birth rituals or sacred bows bestowed by goddesses, just sweat, training, and mutual respect. So what gives? Well, Herodotus had a flair for spectacle. He wasn't writing for archaeologists. He was writing for an audience of curious Greeks who'd never set foot beyond the Aegean. To them, the steppe might as well have been outer space. And the women who lived there, aliens, beautiful, lethal aliens who somehow fought better than the local militia. That's the thing about Amazons. In Greek storytelling, they weren't just characters. They were the opposite of everything respectable Athenian women were supposed to be. In a world where upper-class Greek women were mostly confined to domestic roles, the image of a spear-wielding, horseback-riding woman who could beat you at your own war game, that hit a nerve. So naturally, the Greeks did what every culture does when it feels threatened. They turned it into entertainment. Amazons became regular features in Greek vase art, shown in detailed battle scenes where they clash with heroes like Heracles and Theseus. But look closer, they're not caricatures. They wear similar armor, ride similar horses, and sometimes they're even shown wounding the heroes. That's not an accident. That's nervous respect disguised as storytelling. And Herodotus, he leaned into it. He described how the Amazons didn't speak Greek, didn't follow Greek customs, and weren't interested in Greek men unless, of course, it was to best them in a duel. Basically, ancient Greece's ultimate don't mess with Miguel gang. One quirky twist in his tale, he claims that when the Scythians first tried to woo these fierce ladies, they were ignored. So the men changed tactics, setting up camps nearby, mirroring the Amazons' actions until the women eventually warmed up. It's the oldest trick in the romantic comedy book. Step 1. Don't chase. Step 2. Learn archery. Still, no one's found evidence of a mass merging of tribes in the way Herodotus describes. It's possible that he exaggerated or that he took a real cultural exchange and gave it a mythological makeover. Because, let's face it, a story where love blooms over shared horseback archery is way more interesting than they probably traded horses and got along fine. Because obviously, snow builds character and biceps. You sit cross-legged on the grass now, Herodotus still chattering in your ear. He's good company, if a bit theatrical. He rolls another scroll open and shows you a drawing. Well, technically it's a rough sketch with labels that make no sense, but it's supposed to be a map of the Amazon homeland. Somewhere northeast of the Black Sea. Kind of, maybe. Look, geography wasn't his thing. Even now, scholars debate whether the Amazons were ever a real tribe with a unified identity or simply a catch-all term for warrior women from various nomadic groups. Maybe the Greeks met a few Scythian women who could outride and outshoot their men and decided to make them the face of female ferocity forever. It wouldn't be the first time reality got upgraded into legend. And here's the kicker. For all the savage otherness Herodotus assigns them, he also clearly admires them. You can hear it in his tone. These women didn't just defy expectations, they rewrote them. And that made them irresistible subjects for a culture obsessed with both heroism and cautionary tales. One fringe theory suggests that the Amazon myth might have roots even older than the Scythians in Mesopotamian tales of goddess-worshipping warrior clans, or perhaps in Indo-European folklore that travelled across the steppes long before Herodotus put quill to scroll. But whatever their origin, the Amazons became a kind of narrative Rorschach test. To Greeks, they were wild but noble. To Romans, later on, they were rebellious but beatable. And to you, well, they're starting to feel oddly familiar. You stand now, brushing dust from your pants, and thank Herodotus for the drama. He bows, naturally, as if he's just finished a sold-out monologue on Broadway. The scrolls vanish, the voice fades, but his stories, they stick, because myth or memory, whisper or war cry once, you've met an Amazon. She never really leaves your head. You're riding again just a bit wobbly this time, because let's face it, horseback archery isn't something you pick up overnight. But the view, breathtaking. Vast stretches of dry grass ripple like ocean waves, and somewhere in the distance, a hawk circles lazily, probably judging your pasture. You've left the camp behind, trailing a group of riders headed farther east. You're tracing a path that some believe the real Amazon warriors may have traveled across the sprawling Eurasian steppe through what's now Ukraine, southern Russia, and into Kazakhstan. You're not just chasing legends anymore. You're chasing archaeological breadcrumbs. The first clue arrives as a bump underfoot. You dismount and kneel, brushing aside the dry grass, a faint mound, unnatural in shape. It's not a rock, it's a Kurgan burial mound, one of thousands scattered across the steppe. Think of them as time capsules, carefully constructed by nomadic tribes to honor their dead. And this one, it's not just any Kurgan. Inside, buried beneath layers of soil, stone, and timber, archaeologists recently uncovered something that raised a lot of eyebrows. You peek into the reconstructed scene, a woman's skeleton, laid out with reverence, surrounded by weapons, iron-tipped arrows, a short sword, a dagger, jewelry, yes, but also a battle axe, not decorative, functional, lethal. She's not the only one. In fact, around 1/3 of Scythian and Sarmatian burials that include weapons belong to women. This isn't your standard grave goods situation. These are war kits. And some of these women even show evidence of healed battle injuries, rib fractures, skull trauma, sword cuts to the arm, occupational hazards. Historians still argue whether this represents a cultural norm for all women warriors, or if these were rare exceptions, but the numbers keep growing. One site in western Russia contained the remains of 4 young females, all buried with weapons. One of them was around 13. That's not symbolic. That's a career cut short. What really made heads turn, though, were the DNA tests. In several burials long thought to contain male warriors because, well, obviously only men carried swords, right? The skeletons turned out to be female. This sparked what you might call an archaeological facepalm moment. Turns out, bones don't lie, but assumptions. Oh, they're chronic oversharers. You walk slowly through a virtual recreation of these burial sites. No grand tombs, no statues, just compact, efficient graves filled with the stuff of survival bridles, quivers, cooking gear, arrowheads. You're struck by how much these women were prepared for, well, everything. Life, war, cold weather, nosy archaeologists 2,000 years later. There's one grave that stays with you. A young woman, early 20s. Her bow rests beside her, snapped in half, maybe a funerary custom. Her skull bears a deep but healed gash. Near her hand is a polished bronze mirror. No inscription, no name, but somehow you feel like she's saying, yeah, I earned every scar. You rise from the virtual burial field, dust off your pants again, the steppe is really clingy, and ponder the ripple effect of these discoveries. For centuries, the Amazon myth was brushed off as, well, myth. But now, the lines are blurring, and the biggest irony, these warrior women weren't trying to be mythical. They weren't riding out for immortality. They were just living, riding, hunting, fighting, surviving. It was the world around them that decided their lives needed explaining. And what do you do when you can't explain something? You turn it into a story. One quirky tidbit: in one burial, archaeologists found a pouch filled with charred cannabis seeds. Maybe for ritual use, maybe for pain relief. Maybe she just liked to chill after battle, no judgment. As the sun dips lower, the shadows stretch long across the land, and you start to sense how these women became legend, not because of how they died, but because of how completely they lived. With skill, with strength, and with a sense of autonomy that still echoes loudly today. You stand at the crest of a kurgan and imagine the view 2,500 years ago. Different sky, same wind, no power lines or highways. Just grass, horses, and the slow smoke from a distant campfire. And somewhere down there, a girl not so different from you sharpens her arrows, tightens her saddle strap, and gets ready to ride into tomorrow. The wind kicks up as you step down from the kurgan, and for a second, the air seems to shimmer. You blink, and just like that, the scene around you shifts. The endless step stays put, but the smell changes: more leather, more metal, and just a hint of fermented mare's milk. You've crossed into the Sarmatian era, centuries after the Scythians, but still deep in the homeland of the real Amazon contenders. The Sarmatians were another nomadic people of the steppe, closely related to the Scythians in language and lifestyle, but they took things even further. You're not just observing a culture with women warriors now. You're in a society where female fighters might have outnumbered the men during wartime. You follow a group of Sarmatian riders trotting across the grasslands, their long tunics flaring behind them, bows slung casually over their backs like an afterthought. It's hard to tell at first who's male and who's female, and maybe that's the point. Gender roles here weren't carved in stone, they were written in movement. Sarmatian women weren't just exceptions, they were trained, prepared, ready. Archaeological digs across Ukraine and southern Russia have revealed dozens of female burials with weapons, not just scattered arrowheads, but full riding kits, bronze armor fragments, and the curved Akhenake sword, short and sharp and designed for close combat. And again, many of these skeletons show signs of actual fighting. These weren't ceremonial daggers. These women didn't just look tough, they were. Historians still argue whether these women had formal military roles, or if they simply took up arms when necessary, like if their husbands were away, or if a rival tribe got ideas. But the sheer frequency of these warrior graves makes one thing clear: fighting wasn't something that disqualified a woman from honor. It was part of her identity. And then there's the fringe theory that keeps popping up, that some of these women weren't just fighters, but leaders, tribal chiefs, spiritual figures, tacticians. While most historians tread carefully around that claim, it's not hard to imagine a girl who grew up on horseback, learned to shoot before she could cook, and led her people into battle by the time she was 20. I mean, what were you doing at 20? Exactly. You ride alongside one of them, now a woman in her 30s, her braid tied with small metal beads. She's quiet, focused, scanning the horizon. Her horse responds to every shift in her hips. You ask her name, and she laughs. Names are for graves, she says. I'm still riding. A younger girl sharpens arrowheads, while another works beeswax into a bowstring. They don't pose. They don't lecture. This is just what evening looks like in a world where survival is shared labor. One particularly vivid grave found in western Kazakhstan offers a glimpse into how these women lived and died. She was buried with a helmet, arrowheads, and her bones showed a pierced wound to the thigh, possibly from a spear. Her pelvis showed signs of horseback riding from an early age, worn almost like a callus. She wasn't a visitor to the battlefield. She was a veteran. And in many of these graves, we find not just weapons, but mirrors. It's a detail that makes you pause. These women fought, yes, but they also painted their eyes with ochre and traced tattoos across their arms. They didn't choose between war and beauty, they held both. One Sarmatian custom even suggests that some women performed battle rites while pregnant, blessing their unborn children with warrior protection. That might sound legendary, but petroglyphs and amulets found near some graves hint at ceremonial practices involving both motherhood and warfare. For them, those two states weren't opposites, they were parallel tracks. And here's the kicker. Ancient Roman sources, who were notoriously snooty, describe fighting Sarmatian women during their military campaigns and were not happy about it. Effeminate barbarians, one grumbles, another laments that his troops were shamed by women. You can almost hear the wounded ego. It's glorious, but beyond all the bravado, there's something tender here, too. These women didn't just fight against, they fought for their clans, their families, their stories, and yes, for themselves. One quirky bit of evidence that scholars still puzzle over. Tiny bronze horse masks, found in some graves, just big enough to fit a foal. Maybe decorative, maybe ceremonial, or maybe just proof that even baby horses got some swagger. As the fire burns low, the rider with the bead-tied braid offers you a carved drinking horn. You sip, it's sour, smoky, and probably older than your digestive system is comfortable with. But it warms your chest, and that's enough. She looks at you and says, "You think we were stories, but we were storms." You wake to the sound of hoofbeats, rhythmic, insistent, like a heartbeat echoing across centuries. Only now, it's not the vast steppe stretching out before you. It's stone grey, cold, heavy. You're standing in a Roman military outpost, miles from the empire's center, surrounded by armor-clad soldiers and the occasional goat. The scene feels strange, until you spot something that really doesn't belong. A statue, weather-worn, missing an arm, but unmistakable. A woman in armor, not a toga, not a tunic, not draped in grapes or fanning leaves. She's armored like a soldier, spear in one hand, shield in the other. Not symbolic, not graceful, just fierce. This is where things get interesting. Because while the Romans didn't invent the Amazon myth, they absolutely ran with it. Think of them as the Marvel Studios of ancient myth. They took the stories, added some extra muscle, and marketed them hard. But here's the twist. Rome wasn't just fascinated by Amazons in art and literature. They actually fought women who reminded them of the myth. The Sarmatians, remember, Rome spent centuries clashing with Sarmatian tribes along its northeastern frontiers. The Roman historian Cassius Dio even notes with some irritation that these people fight equally well on horseback and on foot, even the women. In fact, one of the most fascinating Roman records involves Sarmatian cavalry troops who were taken into Roman service after being defeated. Around 5,500 of them were shipped off to Britain in the 2nd century CE. Yes, that Britain, the one with the fog and Hadrian's Wall and suspicious boiled meats. Some scholars even speculate that these Sarmatian soldiers, many likely trained from youth, alongside female warriors, brought their myths with them. Historians still argue whether this troop transfer directly influenced British legends like King Arthur and the Lady of the Lake. I mean, it's a stretch, but not a ridiculous one. Sword-wielding women, magical lakes, chivalric codes, you do the math. So while Roman generals may have scoffed at the idea of women on the battlefield, they couldn't fully dismiss it. They saw it, and when the Sarmatian women rode into view, the Romans' jaws collectively hit the mosaic floor. Back home, the myth was morphing again. Roman poets like Virgil and Ovid painted Amazons as tragic, powerful outsiders, noble, but doomed. You might remember Penthesilea, the Amazon queen who fought Achilles at Troy. In some versions, she nearly bests him. In others, he kills her and falls in love with her as she dies, because of course he does. That's ancient romance for you. Stab first, feel emotions later. Roman artists, too, loved depicting Amazon emoji battles between Greeks and Amazons in marble reliefs and villa frescoes. These scenes were not subtle, muscles everywhere, chaos, spears flying. But if you look closely, you'll see something else: symmetry. The Amazons aren't portrayed as helpless, they're equals in every frame. The message is mixed admiration wrapped in conquest, one quirky artistic habit. Romans often dressed their Amazons in oddly short chittons that seemed impractical, like battle-ready, but also toga-adjacent. You half expect one to mutter, "I came to fight and serve a look." You walk now through a reconstructed Roman garrison town, complete with bathhouses, temples, and oddly small sandals. And in one corner, a shrine, faded now, but the inscription is still legible. It's dedicated to Diana, the Roman goddess of the hunt, virginal, fierce, often shown with a bow. See what's happening. The Romans didn't just appropriate Amazon imagery, they started to absorb it, merge it, reframe it. In some art, Diana even begins to resemble the Amazon ideal: independent, armed, slightly terrifying. Basically your high school gym coach, but divine. And maybe the biggest surprise: Roman women, at least upper-class ones, were secretly obsessed with Amazons too. Scholars have found frescoes in private Roman homes showing Amazon battles, sometimes painted in bedrooms or private gardens. Why there? Maybe because the myth offered a window into something thrilling, a life outside the villa, outside obedience, outside the usual. Historians still argue whether these images were aspirational or just decorative. But something tells you that if you'd asked one of those Roman matrons what she really thought of Penthesilea, she might have leaned in and whispered, honestly, she was kind of amazing. Riding alone, defending your people, choosing your own fate. You duck into a Roman amphitheater, next stone benches, a dusty stage. At one point, this was a sight for Amazon reenactments. Gladiatorial fights where women were costumed as mythical warriors and pitted against each other for entertainment. It wasn't common, but it happened. And the crowd, they loved it, not because it was realistic, but because, deep down, people knew the myth came from somewhere. So, as the Romans expanded their empire, they kept trying to define and confine the Amazon myth. Sometimes they painted them as villains, sometimes as victims. But they could never quite erase their power. You step back into the sunlight, and for a moment, you swear you see someone atop the hill on horseback, braids snapping in the wind, bow in hand. Not a ghost, not a goddess, just history. You're not sure when the myth started to outgrow the women behind it, but as you leave the amphitheater behind, it becomes clear the Amazons weren't just characters anymore, they were cultural symbols. Shorthand for everything untamed, exotic, and inconvenient to the ancient status quo. You walk now through a gallery of echoing voices, stories etched not in stone, but on the pages of books, painted across urns, whispered down through generations who never quite agreed on what an Amazon really was. Greek writers had one version, Roman generals another. And as the centuries turned, the legend stretched farther, becoming harder to recognize and maybe harder to trust. By the time you reach the medieval period, you're squinting at a tapestry and a woman in armor holding a sword the size of a canoe. Her waist is tiny, her eyes are enormous, the whole thing less like battle prep and more like cosplay at a castle-themed convention. Here's where the myth begins to slide into fantasy. The real steppe women, the Scythians, Sarmatians, Soromatians start fading from memory, and in their place, warrior queens who live in forests no one can locate, islands full of women who've banished all men, and cities built by magic. It's like the world couldn't handle their reality, so it dialed the drama up to 11. One of the strangest turns the myth takes. The idea that Amazons lived in a matriarchal utopia, a society where women ruled, men were servants or breeding stock, and once a year, the ladies went to the mountains to, recruit. If they had boys, they sent them away. Girls stayed and learned the ways of war. Historians still argue whether this was based on misunderstanding, exaggeration, or pure invention. Most agree it reflects more about the cultures telling the stories than the ones they were supposedly describing. In short, fear of powerful women tends to make storytellers go a little nuts. Meanwhile, the real archaeology, those burial sites you visited, the weapons, the bones, the healed battle wounds, was slowly being buried under legend. Literally, by the Middle Ages, few people in Europe even remembered the names of the Scythians or the Sarmatians. But the Amazons, oh, they endured. Even cartographers got in on it. Old maps from the 15th and 16th centuries include places labeled Amazon River or Land of the Amazons, and no, that wasn't wishful thinking. It was a full-on geographical misfire. Early European explorers, especially the Portuguese, sailed into South America and thought, hey, the fierce women here must be Amazons. But here's the wild part: historians still argue whether those accounts were exaggerated, lost in translation, or based on actual warrior women from tribes like the Tapuyas or the Icamibas. Some even suggest the women were simply defending their homes, not operating a fantasy kingdom of man-haters. Either way, the Amazon name stuck. To this day, the largest rainforest in the world carries the echo of a misunderstood myth from halfway across the globe. A ghost of Scythia riding through the jungle, wearing a feathered headdress instead of bronze armor. Back in Europe, the Amazons kept popping up in weird places. Renaissance art gave them flowing gowns and gentle expressions. Opera turned them into swooning queens. And by the 18th century, they were showing up in novels and ballets, still fierce, but increasingly romanticized. You walk through a candlelit salon now, powdered wigs everywhere, everyone talking about exotic lands and noble savages. One man puffs a pipe and declares, the Amazons are proof that even women, when left unchecked, may develop the arts of war. To many uncanny similarities across centuries and cultures. It's like the world kept finding its way back to the same idea, that women could ride, fight, lead and win. One fringe tidbit you spot in a dusty corner of a Renaissance study. A folio showing the Queen of the Amazons meeting Alexander the Great. Some versions say she asked him for a child. Others claim she challenged him to single combat. Most scholars think neither event happened, but you can't help but smile at the idea of a warrior queen showing up at a conqueror's camp and saying, "Hi, just here to make history uncomfortable." The wind carries the distant sounds of hooves and war cries, but also laughter sharp, unbothered, echoing across time. You realize then that myths don't have to be consistent. They just have to be loud enough to survive. And these women, their footsteps were loud enough to wake empires. You open your eyes again, and suddenly you're somewhere entirely new, lush, humid, and buzzing with life. 1,000 shades of green surround you, broken only by the glint of water winding through the trees. The air smells like rain and resin, and somewhere in the distance, a monkey is definitely judging you. Welcome to the Amazon rainforest, Jess. That Amazon, the one we just mentioned. And no, it's not a coincidence. We've now drifted into a curious chapter where myth and colonialism collide, with European explorers wandering through uncharted terrain and projecting their wildest stories onto it. Think of it like real estate branding, but with more machetes and malaria. When the Spanish expedition led by Francisco de Orellana sailed down the Great River in 1542, they reportedly encountered indigenous tribes with women fighting alongside men. According to the chronicler Gaspar de Carvajal, these women were tall, fierce, and highly organized in battle. Orellana possibly bruised both in ego and armor declared them Amazons, borrowing the myth straight from Greek lore and slapping it onto the jungle. Now here's where it gets both weird and oddly familiar. The explorers' descriptions of these warrior women echoed things said about the Scythian centuries earlier: mounted archers, matriarchal leadership, fierce in battle. Only this time, the women were canoe-riding jungle fighters with poison-tipped arrows. The myth had migrated continents. Historians still argue whether Aureliana was embellishing to secure fame, gold, or royal favor. Some suggest he misread the situation entirely. What looked like female-led combat could have been tribe-specific, or even situational. Others think the warriors were real, and that stories of female-led resistance in the Amazon basin predated the Spanish by generations. Fringe theories have a field day with this moment. Some claim the Amazonian women were descendants of lost Greco-Sarmatian migrants, somehow shipwrecked and thriving in South America. That one's about as likely as a Spartan smoothie bar, but still, it shows how persistent the myth became. It started bending space, time, and logic. One tantalizing thread. Indigenous Brazilian oral traditions include tales of the Icamiabas, a tribe of powerful women who lived without men, defended their territory fiercely, and met with male warriors once a year at a sacred riverbank to continue their line. Sound familiar? Of course. These stories were filtered through European ears already primed to hear Amazon in anything involving assertive women. But the resonance is striking. It's as if the archetype of the woman warrior kept emerging wherever it was needed, whether in the Scythian steppe, the Roman borderlands, or the dense green lungs of South America. You move through a recreated Amazonian village now, barefoot on packed red earth. The homes are woven from palms, open to the air, and you can hear the low murmur of generations. A grandmother tells a girl to fear the jungle, but to learn from it. A mother sharpens a fishing spear with practiced ease. In every gesture, there's a quiet kind of power. The thing that hits you hardest, the normalcy. These aren't mythical women, they're just women. Living, teaching, protecting, and surviving in a land that demands nothing less than full commitment. Now fast forward a few centuries, as colonialism tightens its grip on the New World, the Amazon myth is repackaged again. This time for pamphlets, travelogues, and royal audiences back in Europe. The narrative twists from awe to exoticism to justification. These lands, they claim, are wild, untamed, ruled by women no less. Clearly, they must be conquered. One particularly strange quirk, the 17th century European fascination with breast removal. Yeah, that weird myth we brushed past earlier resurfaces here in full, lurid detail. The idea that Amazons cut off their right breast to shoot better with a bow gets plastered all over art and texts. Never mind that archery doesn't actually require that. Never mind that no skeletal evidence backs it up. The story sticks because it's gruesome and memorable to key ingredients for folklore longevity. Historians still argue whether this detail originated from a linguistic misunderstanding. The Greek word amazos could mean without breast, or, alternatively, it may have had nothing to do with breasts at all. It's possible the name Amazon derived from an old Iranian word meaning warrior. But once someone threw in an anatomy-based pun, history ran with it, like a frat boy with a Sharpie. Now you stand at the mouth of the great Amazon River. The water is dark, wide, and endlessly moving. Somewhere far upstream, the Icamiabas may have once stood guard. Somewhere in these forests, a memory pulses beneath the roots. You feel the weight of a name borrowed from myth, placed on a landscape, and made real by centuries of repetition. And here's the soft punchline: the Amazon rainforest doesn't care. It grows over stories as easily as it grows over stone. Vines wrap around statues, trees reclaim battlefields. What survives are the whispers, the echoes, and the questions we still ask, because even now, in the 21st century, archaeologists are still unearthing evidence of complex societies deep in the Amazon matrilineal lines, ceremonial centers, possible war leaders who were women. Nothing definitive yet, but enough to keep the debate alive. So as you dip your hand into the cool river water and watch the ripples spread, you wonder not for the first time if the myth of the Amazons has lasted this long, because somewhere, buried under mud and memory, it was always a little bit true. The river fades behind you like a long exhale, and the jungle dissolves into parchment and ink. You're standing now in a dimly lit library, The air thick with dust, and that old book must equal parts mystery and mildew. Around you are rows of manuscripts, each one bearing yet another version of the same story, retold for a different audience, dressed in new metaphors, but always with the same beating heart: women who fight. This chapter of the Amazon myth doesn't ride on horseback or canoe. It sits at a writing desk, sometimes with a candle, sometimes a printing press. As empires rise and fall, the Amazons evolve with the times, especially in the minds of scholars, philosophers, and early anthropologists, who can't quite decide if they're dealing with real people, cautionary tales, or poetic license gone rogue. By the 18th century, Enlightenment thinkers are furiously cataloguing everything: plants, insects, human skulls, you name it. Naturally, they try to squeeze the Amazons into a tidy little taxonomy too. Were they a myth, a memory, or some socio-political allegory disguised as a bedtime story? Historians still argue whether the Enlightenment scholars helped preserve the legend or simply distorted it even more. Take Montesquieu, for example. He saw Amazons as symbols of natural law, topsy-turvy proof that when women lead, society deviates from its proper course. Charming, right? Others weren't quite so dismissive. Some, like the naturalist Buffon, entertained the idea that matriarchal societies had once existed, and that the Amazon myth was a remnant of those forgotten structures. Still others, writing from salons and smoky coffee houses, simply treated the Amazons as curiosities, fascinating but implausible, like unicorns with javelins. But not everyone in Europe was content to leave the Amazons as mythic wallpaper. A few scholars and travelers began digging figuratively and literally. They started linking ancient texts with strange burial sites being uncovered on the steppes and in the Caucasus. A skeleton buried with weapons, armor, bow marks on the spine. This was long before radiocarbon dating, mind you. So most of it was guesswork tied with string and wishful thinking. Still, the seed had been planted. Maybe, just maybe, the Amazons weren't invented. Maybe they were misremembered. One especially quirky side road comes from the pen of Johann Jakob Batjevan, a 19th century Swiss historian who believed humanity began in a matriarchal phase ruled by goddesses, priestesses, and yes, possibly Amazons. According to him, patriarchy was a later development, a kind of societal correction. You can practically hear the Freud before Freud vibe humming in the background. Bachofen's theories were fringe then, and they're still debated today, but they spark something, a ripple through intellectual circles. What if the Amazons weren't fantasy, but forgotten fact? Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the newly forming United States was having its own Amazon moment. As the Revolutionary War gave way to a budding republic, American women were invoked as modern-day Amazons in propaganda and poems. The idea wasn't to terrify, but to inspire. These women, like their mythic predecessors, were capable, virtuous, and ready to defend liberty. It's funny how fast fear turns into flattery when you need volunteers. You're walking now past paintings and engravings from this era. They show women holding muskets, standing beside soldiers, planting flags. The word Amazon is etched in curly script across banners and book covers. Suddenly, the myth is no longer something foreign or other. It's being adopted as a badge of honor. But here's where the story splits again, depending on who's telling it. In feminist writings of the 19th century, the Amazon is a symbol of lost power, a woman's strength pushed into myth, because history wasn't ready to make room for it. Writers like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Matilda Jocelyn Gage referenced warrior women as proof that patriarchy wasn't inevitable. They didn't just want voting rights, they wanted a reckoning with forgotten queens and generals. At the same time, you've got Victorian novels turning Amazons into romantic figures, exotic, tragic, tall, of course, always tall, often doomed to fall in love with the wrong man and die dramatically in a corset. Because heaven forbid a powerful woman just keeps going, you roll your eyes again. Still, the legend survives because it adapts. The Amazon morphs with culture, like a chameleon in bronze armor. To some, she's terrifying, to others, aspirational. But always she refuses to be erased. You pause beside a rare book, its leather binding cracked like dessert skin. Inside, a hand-drawn map shows Amazonia sprawled across South America. There's a line marking a city of women, somewhere deep in the interior, no coordinates, just imagination. A dotted line curves toward it, labeled Unknown Danger. And isn't that the heart of it? The Amazon myth endures because it occupies a space between known and unknowable. Real bones, real weapons, real women paired with stories too wild for textbooks and too persistent to ignore. The myth has lived in battlefields and libraries, riverbanks and ballrooms, and it's never stayed still. You look up. The library is empty now, the silence broken only by the creak of old wood and the soft scratch of a quill long gone. Somewhere in that silence, you hear a whisper, not in Greek or Latin or Spanish, but in the universal language of things that refuse to be forgotten. The Amazons weren't just riders or warriors. They were an idea that kept riding through history, long after the hooves stopped echoing. You walk out of the dim library and blink into bright sunlight. Now you're standing on a dusty excavation site, somewhere in the windswept grasslands of Central Asia. The wind tugs at your sleeves, dry and sharp-edged, carrying with it the scent of earth and iron. Archaeologists crouch around an open burial mound. Shovels clink, brushes sweep, a glint of bronze catches the light. This is where things get tangible, where bone, artifact, and legend begin to align. Welcome to the modern archaeological revival of the Amazons. For centuries, Amazon lore was dismissed as myth, misinterpretation, or the ancient equivalent of fantasy fan fiction. But starting in the late 20th century, something began to shift. In the Eurasian steppes across Ukraine, southern Russia, and into Kazakhstan, archaeologists began uncovering a stunning number of kurgans, burial mounds once used by nomadic horse cultures like the Scythians and Sarmatians. Inside, the usual grave goods, weapons, jewelry, tools, and wait for it, female skeletons buried with swords, daggers, bows, and arrowheads. Not ceremonial items, either. These showed signs of use. In some cases, the bones had combat injuries, arrow wounds, healed fractures, stress marks in the shoulders from years of riding and archery. Historians still argue whether these women were full-time warriors or just elite figures buried with status symbols. But the evidence points to something more robust. DNA testing confirmed the biological sex. Radiocarbon dating nailed the timelines. Many of these warrior women lived between the 6th and 4th centuries BCE, perfectly overlapping with the time Greek authors were writing about the Amazons to the east. In another, the woman's skull had been deformed intentionally, a common practice among some nomadic cultures, giving the head an elongated, conical shape. Imagine facing someone like that on a battlefield. You wouldn't know if you should surrender or offer them a movie deal. You stand now at the edge of a freshly opened mound. Inside lies a woman, broad-shouldered, tall by ancient standards, her spine curved from years of riding. A quiver rests beside her, full of iron-tipped arrows. Her hand still curls slightly, as if gripping something long vanished. The silence around her isn't eerie, it's reverent. And yet, for all this tangible evidence, there's still resistance. Why? Because accepting a widespread tradition of female warriors in antiquity, rewriting more than a few chapters of history, it means questioning our assumptions about gender roles, power structures, and what normal looked like in the ancient world. That's the thing about archaeological truth. It's not just about digging in the ground. It's about unearthing bias. One scholarly debate still raging involves frequency. Were these warrior women common among the Scythians and their cultural cousins? Or were they exceptions, outliers from elite families or rare circumstances? Some estimates suggest that up to 37% of Scythian female graves contain weapons, many of them clearly used. That's not a coincidence. That's a pattern. And while the Scythians weren't the only nomadic group to practice gender flexibility in combat roles, they're certainly the best preserved, partly thanks to the dry climate and, weirdly enough, permafrost. See, some of these burial sites were locked in ice for centuries. Bodies frozen in time, like ancient action figures still in the packaging. When they thawed, they brought with them preserved clothing, gear, and even tattoos. Yes, tattoos. Some women had intricate ink across their shoulders and arms, stylized animals, abstract swirls, all linked in black. Imagine the stories those tattoos told, the battles they commemorated, the alliances they sealed. You walk through a reconstructed Scythian encampment now. The air smells of leather and horsehair. Children dart between tents. Women tend fires, braid hair, and practice archery. One teenager hits a straw target dead center, then smiles without looking smug. Power here is fluid. Authority moves with competence, not chromosomes. And unlike the Greek perception of Amazons as man-hating hermits, Scythian culture was more nuanced. These were societies built on mobility, cooperation, and adaptation. Both men and women had to know how to fight, hunt, survive. It wasn't ideology, it was practicality. In the steppes, nature didn't care about gender norms. And neither, it seems, did the ancestors buried with bows in their hands. So, how did these real-life warrior women become the stuff of ancient myth? One theory is that the Greeks encountered the Scythians during trade or war and were so stunned by their gender roles that they mythologized the experience. It was easier to make them other, to wrap them in legend than to integrate them into the expected model of civilization. These women fight, must be witches or Amazons. Definitely not just regular people. That pattern hasn't exactly vanished. Today, the real faces of these warrior women are being reconstructed by forensic artists using skull shapes, muscle indicators, and a bit of modern science wizardry. The results are quietly humbling. Women with strong jaws, practical braids, and eyes that look like they could see straight through you. One digital rendering went viral. People commented things like, "She looks like she could lead a Netflix series," or "She looks like my gym instructor," which is the point. She looks real, not like a goddess or a comic book hero. Just a woman who lived, fought, and mattered. And that's the twist in the tale. The closer we get to the truth of the Amazons, the less mythical they become and the more human. You look back at the burial site. A team is gently covering the bones again, preserving them for a future study. The wind carries away the dust, and in that moment, you realize something. There are daggers polished to mirror brightness, gold torque necklaces heavy with gravitas, arrowheads sharp enough to whisper threats across millennia. But tonight, you're not here for the artifacts. You're here to meet the women who brought them into modern light. Welcome to the era of the women archaeologists, the ones who dug, decoded, and dared to ask, what if the Amazons were real? Because challenging old narratives doesn't just mean digging up bones. It means breaking through the sediment of centuries of male-dominated assumptions. Let's start with Jeanine Davis Kimball, the late American archaeologist who spent decades in the field, mainly in southern Russia and Kazakhstan. She's not a household name, but she probably should be. In the 1990s, Davis Kimball began noticing something curious. A significant number of kurgans in the Eurasian steppes held the remains of women buried with weapons, not kitchen utensils, not pottery, weapons. Her groundbreaking 1997 expedition to the Pokrovka region uncovered what she called real warrior women. One grave, in particular, contained a female skeleton with a dagger tucked near the hand, a bow beside the leg, and arrowheads clustered around the pelvis like stars. She called them warrior priestesses. Academic circles raised their collective eyebrow. Interesting, they said, but surely ceremonial. But even skeptics admit her fieldwork forced a necessary conversation. It reopened the door. It asked, who decides what's myth and what's just inconvenient history? She nicknamed one the Amazon Girl, and theorized that the cultural memory of these warrior women had never entirely vanished. It had just gone quiet, humming in the blood of descendants. She wasn't alone in her quest. Around the same time, a Ukrainian archaeologist named Natalia Polosmuk made headlines with the discovery of the Ice Maiden on the Yukot Plateau in Siberia. Though not technically a warrior, her grave was full of intricate tattoos and fine clothing. She was buried with such honor and isolation that scholars believe she held spiritual power. Another kind of Amazon, maybe not in armor, but certainly in authority. You walk past a row of portraits, now not the ancient warriors, but the modern women who brought their stories into daylight. They stand beside excavation pits, sunburned and unsmiling, holding trowels like wands. They weren't chasing legends, they were rewriting textbooks, quietly, methodically, sometimes in the face of flat-out disbelief. One researcher who deserves more love than she gets is Adrienne Mayer. She isn't an archaeologist herself, but a historian and folklorist who dove headfirst into the Amazon question with her book The Amazons, Lives and Legends of Warrior Women Across the Ancient World. Mayer's genius was in cross-referencing ancient texts with modern archaeological finds. She connected dots between Herodotus' wild stories and the evidence coming out of Kazakhstan and Russia. Her thesis, the Amazons weren't made up, they were misunderstood. Greek writers had encountered real Scythian and Sarmatian warrior women, but lacking cultural context, they turned them into mythology. Mayer's research gave scholarly backbone to what had long been labeled as fiction. She's also the one who pointed out that Greek art depicting Amazons evolved over time. Early on, they're foreign-looking, almost monstrous. But as centuries pass, they become more human, more beautiful, more Greek, because as much as the Greeks feared the idea of fighting women, they also couldn't stop admiring them. You know, typical, you pause now at a digital display. A holographic Amazon warrior flickers to life, reconstructed from multiple grave sites. She's tall, muscled, her hair's braided tight against her scalp, her armor a patchwork of leather and scale. She raises her bow not in aggression, but as if to ask, "Are you ready to see me clearly now?" Some of the burial sites had been dismissed decades earlier by male archaeologists who assumed weapon-bearing skeletons must be male. They didn't test, they didn't question, just labeled and moved on. Now, researchers are revisiting old catalogues, retesting bones with modern technology, and guess what? Turns out a lot of warrior men were actually warrior women, no beard, bones included. The future of Amazon studies isn't in retelling the same myths, it's in listening to the dirt, in following the trail of braided hair, arrow-worn vertebrae, and the stubborn curiosity of women who wouldn't take legend for an answer. You kneel by another excavation pit, fingertips brushing soil so ancient it's almost sacred. You hear it again, that whisper. I was real, I was here, and I fought. No, now you're following a trail across a map once scrawled in myth, migration, and cultural echo. Because the legacy of the Amazons didn't end with burial mounds and broken bronze. It wandered west, it whispered into folklore. It tangled itself into the roots of a dozen later legends. And tonight, you trace those footsteps where the warrior woman archetype went after she disappeared from the steppes. You blink, and suddenly you're standing in the rolling green of medieval Europe. There's the faint clang of blacksmith hammers in the distance, church bells somewhere closer, and the heavy scent of damp earth and sheep. You might think you're worlds away from the open skies of Scythia, but look again. In the tapestry hanging from a castle wall, a woman rides a warhorse in chainmail. In her hand, a spear, at her side, a hawk, and her face. Strong, determined, familiar. That's Penthesilea, or at least, Europe's reimagining of her. You see, even after classical antiquity declared the Amazons defeated, their story didn't die. It simply adapted. Throughout the Middle Ages, Amazon figures resurfaced in romance, literature, and folklore, though often filtered through a Christian or courtly lens. They became cautionary tales, or noble exceptions female knights in chastity belts, battling sin and Saracens. Historians still argue whether these medieval Amazons were meant to honor real history or to suppress it under layers of myth-making and morality. And then there's the Renaissance. Ah yes, that grand era of rediscovery where everyone suddenly remembered how brilliant the Greeks and Romans were and decided to start copy-pasting their stories. The Amazons made a big comeback in art and literature, except now they were topless, idealized, and often tragic. You know, typical Renaissance priorities. Let's remember female warriors. But let's make them sexy, doomed, and totally in need of a strong male counterbalance. In some early 16th century texts, people actually tried to pinpoint where the Amazon homeland was. Some suggested the Caucasus, others claimed it was along the Don River. A few bold souls insisted the Amazon tribe had simply moved to South America. You know, that place that got accidentally named Amazonia after European explorers fought fierce women upriver and assumed, yes, the myth must have migrated. The Amazon name appears like a breadcrumb trail, river, rainforest, street names, pop culture characters. But what connects all of them isn't geography, it's memory. A memory of women who didn't wait for permission to fight. Women who could draw a bowstring and a line in the sand. From 17th century operas to 19th century novels, the Amazon re-emerged in every era's aesthetic. Sometimes noble, sometimes savage, always exoticized, always other, but her spirit endured. You peek inside a Victorian cabinet of curiosities, porcelain figurines of Amazon queens, riding lions and holding impossible weapons. The Victorians, obsessed with gender roles, yet secretly fascinated by rebellion, loved the contradiction. A woman in power, scandalous, but a fictional one. Safe, marketable, ideal for sets and adventure novels. Fast forward now to the 20th century. You're in a grainy black and white cinema, watching a pre-war serial with a jungle queen leaping from vines. The Amazon now wears animal print, saves the hero, and has impeccable lipstick. It's campy, it's exaggerated, and yet, she's still fighting, still here. Of course, pop culture would truly go full circle with Wonder Woman, created in the 1940s by psychologist William Moulton Marston, who also helped invent the lie detector. Yes, seriously, Wonder Woman was explicitly designed as a modern Amazon. She hailed from an island of warrior women, wielded a magical lasso, and stood for peace until she had to punch someone in the face. Over time, her backstory evolved, tangled with Greek myth, and returned us to the Messiah in a fictional stand-in for all those lost Scythian steppe communities. Open scholarly debate. Historians still can't agree whether pop culture versions of Amazons help reclaim the truth or bury it deeper beneath fantasy. On one hand, they inspire, on the other, they distract from the real women who bled and battled. It's a delicate dance between homage and erasure. But there's hope in the recognition, in the resurgence of interest, in every modern archaeologist who says, actually, yes, this skeleton with a spear was female. No, that's not unusual. You close the map now, tuck it under your arm, and step back into the wind. The past isn't gone. It's just layered. Like armor, like myth, like the scars you don't need to see to believe. The wind shifts again, brushing through tall grass and tugging you further from the pages of myth and back toward the bone and breath of actual lives lived. You cross back into the Scythian steppe, same place, different focus, because now it's time to look at something even more intimate than burial mounds or battlefield myths. Tonight, you slip inside the daily rhythms of the real women warriors. The Amazons, stripped of fantasy and Hollywood, just living. So, what did a day in the life of an Amazon actually look like? Well, forget satin tunics and perfectly coiffed battle braids. You wake up before sunrise, huddled in a felt tent called a yurt, the air inside smoky with last night's embers. Your breath puffs white in the cold. You stretch aching limbs, Sleep wasn't luxurious. There's no feather mattress or lavender oil. There's a sheepskin, maybe, and the sound of horses nickering outside. You pull on your gear layers of wool, leather, and metal if you've got it. Breastplates weren't custom fitted. They were functional, sometimes stitched from hardened leather and scaled bits of iron or bronze. Not exactly red carpet ready, but they'll keep a blade from finding your heart. You're hungry. Breakfast, probably fermented mare's milk kimmy and a slab of dried meat. Not ideal if you're craving pancakes, but it gets the job done. You chew while checking your horse, tightening the saddle, rubbing sleep from your eyes. Historians still argue whether these warrior women lived in exclusively female groups, like the Greek myths suggest, or whether they were part of mixed-gender tribal communities where women simply fought alongside men as equals. The archaeological evidence leans toward the latter, a culture where martial skill mattered more than gender. You step outside the yurt into blinding sunlight, saddle up, and ride. You're not alone. Around you, other women, mothers, daughters, widows are also mounted. They're not unicorns. They're not anomalies. They're your tribe. Training isn't a special event, it's built into life. From childhood, you were expected to ride, shoot, and fight. The horse is practically part of your anatomy. You lean into its rhythm, knocking an arrow and loosing it into a straw target with practiced ease. Quirky side note: some researchers suggest young Scythian girls learned to use a bow before they could even walk properly strapped to the saddle behind an adult, tiny fingers already grasping at arrows. Playpens, try galloping weaponized daycares. Now, let's talk about hygiene. You didn't have a spa, obviously, but you weren't filthy either. Scythians bathed in steam like proto-saunas and used red-hot stones doused in cannabis to create vapor. You'd sweat it out, scrape off dirt with curved blades, and maybe relax after a long day of stabbing things. Some burial finds even included makeup kits, mirrors, pigment pots, tweezers. So yes, you could apply eyeliner and gut a wild boar. And what about relationships? Contrary to the Greek version where Amazons could only hook up with men once a year, and then banish them, you likely had a husband, or at least lovers. Possibly several. Scythian culture wasn't big on rigid monogamy, nor was it shocked by women wielding authority. You might command a troop, or settle a tribal dispute. Your worth wasn't tied to being quiet or pretty, it was tied to what you could do. But don't mistake that for some fantasy utopia. Life was hard. The environment was brutal. Death came early and often through childbirth, war, infection. If you reached 30, you were lucky. Old age wasn't a promise. It was a badge. Evenings weren't for Netflix. You'd share stories around the fire, stitch your own wounds, teach a younger girl how to balance while drawing a bow at full gallop. You talk about dreams, about omens in the stars. Maybe, if you believed in it, you'd honor Tabiti, the hearth goddess, or offer a little food to the earth. You didn't write your prayers, you whispered them into the wind. Here's a fringe theory to drift off with. Some scholars speculate that the myth of Amazons removing one breast to better shoot a bow may have originated not from fact, but from a simple mistranslation of the Greek word amazos, meaning without breast. The idea likely horrified the Greeks, who turned it into something sensational. No skeletons have ever confirmed this practice. Most women warriors were very much symmetrical. Night falls. You return to your yurt. Your weapons are cleaned and stacked. Your horse is fed and resting. You light a small flame and trace the scars on your hands, each one a story. Some victories, some losses, all survival. And here's the most grounding thought of all. You were not unusual. You were not legendary. You were just part of the fabric. You hunted, fought, raised children, braided hair, stitched wounds, mourned your dead. You lived. There's something beautifully human in that. Not mythic, just messy, real, and brave. So you close your eyes on the step floor, under skies so wide they almost swallow you. Somewhere nearby, a wolf howls. You smile. It sounds like a lullaby. Sleep still clings to your shoulders as you stir once more, this time guided deeper into the corridors of power. The wine that once rushed across the steppe whispers gossipy, silken, half-remembered whispers of names that might have been queens, actual Amazon queens, because for all the blur between legend and truth, some names managed to punch through the fog. Let's start with the big one, Penthesilea. Yes, you've met her already charging into Troy like she's late for vengeance. The Greeks painted her as both fierce and doomed, the quintessential tragic heroine. But beyond Homer's poetry, is there a real person behind the name? Historians still argue whether Penthesilea was based on a true Scythian war leader or simply a narrative device in a testosterone-heavy epic. After all, her whole story ends with Achilles killing her, and then allegedly falling in love with her corpse. Yeah, awkward. But here's what's fascinating. That name Penthesilea, it's not an isolated case. In fact, ancient texts list other Amazon queens: Hippolyta, Antiope, Thalestris, all rulers of women who rode like the wind and fought like storms. Could they all be fabrications? Sure. Could they all be based on bits and pieces of real tribal leaders passed down by travelers and traders who couldn't spell their names right? Also very likely. Let's talk Hippolyta for a minute. According to Greek myth, she had a magic girdle like a belt, not shapewear, given to her by Ares, god of war. Hercules, in one of his 12 labors, was tasked with stealing it. Surprise, it didn't end well. Some versions say she handed it over peacefully. Others say he murdered her. You know, casual misogyny wrapped in mythic sparkle. But here's the juicy twist. Some historians propose Hippolyta might have been inspired by real alliances between Scythian tribal queens and Persian kings during the Achaemenid period. In fact, fringe sources hint that Scythian women often negotiated treaties, governed communities, and sometimes even led warriors into diplomatic confrontations, not just battlefield bloodbaths. Then there's Antiope, often conflated with Hippolyta in myth, but sometimes portrayed as the Amazon who defected to the Greeks for love. According to some stories, she married Theseus and bore him a son. Other stories, she was kidnapped. Again, we run into that fine line between romance and abduction that Greek myths love to blur like a soft focus filter on a bad date. And then there's Thalestris, a lesser-known but fascinating Amazon queen allegedly appearing in Alexander the Great's chronicles. The tale goes that she rode across vast terrain to meet Alexander, not to challenge him, but to have his baby. Yep, she supposedly told him, "You're the greatest man, I'm the greatest woman, let's create the perfect child." Bold, right? Alexander reportedly declined, or accepted, or laughed. Depends which source you believe. Historians still argue whether this was an actual diplomatic encounter, a boast invented by Alexander's biographers, or just ancient fan fiction with a power couple twist. Now picture this: you're standing in a throne room with no gold, no velvet cushions, no scepters, just a fire, a circle of warriors, and a woman in a worn leather cloak. She's not commanding with jewels, she's commanding with calluses. Her voice cuts through strategy meetings like a hawk diving for prey. Her authority comes not from divine right, but from demonstrated survival. See, the idea of a queen in Scythian or Sarmatian culture wasn't like monarchs in Europe. Leadership was flexible, earned, often temporary. You might be a war chief one season and a peacekeeper the next, and if you couldn't ride, shoot, or lead, no fancy bloodline could save you. Quirky fact: some of these tribal leaders may have worn elaborate headdresses shaped like birds, crafted from gold and bronze. Archaeologists have found such items in high-status female graves, suggesting they weren't just decorative, they were power symbols. Imagine commanding an army while wearing a golden raptor on your head. Talk about boss energy, but not all queens wore crowns. Some ruled in other ways through family lineage, spiritual guidance, or even as shamans. The line between warrior and mystic blurred often. A woman could be both feared in battle and revered in ritual. There's also tantalizing evidence from Persian and Assyrian records that speak of northern warrior tribes led by women, were these queens. Generals, both. The records don't specify. But the fact that they even notice says something, because remember, most ancient scribes didn't bother documenting women unless they disrupted something. So here's the big takeaway: whether these women were called queens, chiefs, commanders, or simply the one you do not mess with, their leadership was real, measured not in myths, but in miles ridden, enemies defeated, and people protected. Now imagine the stories that didn't get written. The girl who rose to lead after her mother fell in battle, the widow who turned her grief into rebellion, the sister who broke at peace because she knew more blood wasn't the answer. These were queens too, even if no bard sang their names. You step out of the firelit tent and into the silence of night. Above you, the stars don't twinkle, they blaze. Maybe, just maybe, they remember all the names that history forgot. The sky above the steppe remains vast and dark, but your thoughts now drift towards something stickier. What happened after the glory? After the arrows, the horses, the battle cries? What happens when legend calls and real women fade into the dusty drawers of history? Tonight, you trail the legacy of the Amazons, not in the blood-stained soil they rode across, but in how they echoed forward. Into ink, into marble, into awkward Renaissance paintings and modern comic books. You're walking through the long afterlife of the Amazon myth, one messy reboot at a time. So let's talk Herodotus. Again, our favorite ancient Greek gossip was a key player in turning real Scythian women warriors into mythological powerhouses. In histories, he lovingly exaggerates his Amazon tales. But it's not all nonsense. He also describes the Scythians accurately enough to make modern archaeologists perk up. According to him, captured Amazons were so wild and untamable, they killed their captors and fled into the steppes, eventually marrying Scythian men and birthing a new tribe. This might be the closest thing to a cultural origin story ne'er told about the Amazons, and it's suspiciously tidy. Historians still argue whether Herodotus was reporting actual oral traditions from the steppe tribes or just spinning campfire tales for Athenian amusement. But the damager, the influence was done. Greek art soon began pumping out Amazon imagery by the amphrophol. They loved to depict battles between Amazons and Greek heroes, especially Heracles or Theseus. These scenes were intense, spear duels, tumbling horses, expressions frozen in mid-scream. But here's the kicker: Amazons were always losing. There's rarely a painting of them winning. You were the noble opponent, the exotic, erotic, doomed other. It's like the ancient version of, look how cool our enemies are, but don't worry, they still die at the end. And by the time the Christian monks were copying texts in the medieval period, most of the Amazon stories were half lost, reinterpreted as moral warnings or bizarre oddities. Enter the Middle Ages, a time when armoured ladies occasionally popped up in literature and art, often decked out in impossibly impractical chainmail bikinis. You see women labelled Amazons in knightly romances or crusader chronicles, usually portrayed as wild heathens needing salvation or, let's face it, conquering, not the most empowering PR campaign. But here's a quirky one. In 1542, Spanish conquistador Francisco de Orellana claimed he fought a tribe of warrior women in the jungles of South America along the river that would eventually be named the Amazon. That's right. He compared the local female fighters to the legendary Greek ones, and the name stuck. Scholars today suspect what he saw was likely a society where women took up arms during a conflict, or perhaps where leadership roles weren't gender-locked. But thanks to Orellana, the name Amazon jumped continents, so yeah, the entire Amazon rainforest. Named after the myth, not the reality, and the legend kept mutating. During the Enlightenment, European thinkers got obsessed with the idea of ancient matriarchies. Some, like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, romanticized the Amazons as part of a lost golden age of natural female power. Others scoffed. Some colonial explorers went looking for proof in Africa, Asia, even Polynesia. They wanted to find the Amazons the way you'd search for buried treasure. Spoiler, they didn't. Yet, every century or so, the myth got recycled, sometimes as feminist inspiration, sometimes as soft-core fantasy, sometimes both. Which brings us to modern times. Wonder Woman, anyone? Yes, the modern Amazon princess with a tiara and a lasso of truth. Created in 1941 by William Moulton Marston, a psychologist who also invented the lie detector. By the way, he imagined a society of superpowered women living on an island untouched by men. Sound familiar? It's basically the Greek myth, polished with wartime idealism and a lot of red, white, and blue spandex. But here's the twist: Wonder Woman's origins were meant to be empowering. Marston believed women were inherently more peaceful and nurturing, and that giving them cultural power would lead to a better world. So, in a weird way, a comic book tried to correct what centuries of Greek pottery and Roman poetry had twisted. Still, historians remain divided on whether modern Amazon imagery actually helps real history, or buries it deeper in fantasy. For every girl who sees strength and leadership in those armored figures, there's another who only sees costume. And don't even get started on the marketing machine. Amazon-themed movies, novels, fitness routines, you've got gyms named after them. Protein shakes, survival courses, boot camps, all peddling the same basic idea. Be strong, be fierce, be unstoppable like an Amazon. But the question lingers, which Amazon? The myth? Or the Scythian girl buried with her bow and horse bones, who never once called herself that? It's a strange kind of immortality. You're not remembered as you were, but as a glittering, ever-changing symbol. You exist now in mosaic tiles, leather cosplay, and motivational Instagram quotes, and somewhere under it all, the real you: bloody hands, tired limbs, cracked fingernails still waits to be unearthed. A final thought to ride into sleep with: maybe the Amazons never vanished. Maybe they've just been echoing through every woman who picks up the tools of war, the weight of leadership, or the sharp edge of defiance. Quietly, fiercely, still charging forward. You're still with us, sleep tugging gently at the corners of your thoughts. But we've got one more wild detour before full relaxation sets in. Tonight's journey isn't just about legends or war, it's about the bones that refuse to stay silent. And these bones, they talk. Picture a windswept steppe in modern-day Kazakhstan or southern Russia. Open grasslands stretch out endlessly, the sky impossibly big, like it's trying to swallow you. Now imagine a group of archaeologists, half frozen, digging through the permafrost. And suddenly metal scrapes on wood, then bone. Then something stranger. A skeleton wearing jewelry, cradling weapons. And the hips, definitely female. Here's where it gets real. Over the last few decades, as archaeology has finally started giving women more than a footnote, graves of warrior women have turned up across the Eurasian steppes. Not mythical, not symbolic. Actual women buried with swords, daggers, bows, and often horses, sometimes several. These aren't one-offs. We're talking about dozens, possibly hundreds, of burial sites across Ukraine, Russia, Kazakhstan, and Mongolia. Many date between the 6th century BCE and the 4th century CE. And they're not just sprinkled randomly, they're tied to known nomadic cultures. The Scythians, Sarmatians, and Sauromations. You may remember that archaeologists used to assume any skeleton with weapons belonged to a man. Seems logical, right? Except when you actually test the pelvis shape and DNA, a surprising number of these warrior graves belong to women. Up to 1/3 of known Scythian warrior burials are female. Cue the collective gasp from dusty textbooks everywhere. Historians still argue whether these women were full-time warriors, elite bodyguards, or ceremonial figures, but one thing's certain, they weren't sitting at home baking flatbread. They were riding, fighting, dying and getting buried like the battlefield badasses they were. One standout find. In 2004, a burial mound in Siberia revealed a 13-year-old girl buried with a full quiver of arrows, an iron dagger, and horse remains. Her bow hand showed repetitive strain injuries, meaning she didn't just pose with the weapon. She used it. Another grave, nicknamed the Ice Maiden, was uncovered in the Altai Mountains. Preserved in permafrost, she was elaborately tattooed, dressed in ceremonial silk, and buried with 6 horses. While she may not have been a frontline fighter, her importance was obvious. She was either a high priestess or a leader of some kind, royal, respected, possibly feared. And here's the kicker, some of these warrior women matched the ancient descriptions of Amazons almost too well. Tall for their time, muscular, decorated with gold plaques, buried with war gear and occasionally elaborate headdresses. There's even evidence of healed wounds, suggesting not just ritual burial but actual combat experience. Think broken bones, arrowhead scarring, and blade trauma. These weren't decorative tomb props. These were the scars of life. But you're probably wondering, why were these women fighting? Was it a social norm, a wartime necessity, or just a few exceptions to the rule? The answer, frustratingly, is all of the above. Nomadic steppe cultures didn't divide gender roles as rigidly as sedentary empires did. If you could ride a horse and draw a bow, you were valuable regardless of your chromosomes. Plus, in societies where survival depended on mobility, speed, and defending your herd from raiders or rival clans, everyone needed to be combat ready. Even grandma, fringe theory time. There's some suggestion that young girls may have undergone warrior training alongside boys, at least for a time. If you showed promise, you kept going. If not, you might shift into domestic or spiritual roles, kind of like an ancient version of cut from the varsity team, except with more blood and less polyester. A quirky detail: some women were buried with mirrors and combs alongside weapons. Because who says you can't slay and slay, right? Now let's talk horses, because if there's one thing steppe cultures loved more than a good raid, it was a good horse. And Amazons, they were probably the ultimate cavalry. Light, agile, and mounted archers. They could shoot arrows while riding at full speed, twisting their torsos backward to hit pursuers. Imagine the core strength, Pilates, but with wolves chasing you. One scholar described them as the black widows of the grasslands, silent, deadly, and mobile. They weren't brute force infantry, they were chess pieces on horseback, dancing around heavier armies and vanishing into the steppe before you could blink. Modern experiments with traditional Scythian bows, short, recurved, and ridiculously powerful, show that a skilled archer could hit a target while riding at a gallop. At night, in the wind, while yelling insults, probably. It makes you wonder how many of those mythic tales of Amazon ambushes or daring escapes were rooted in this very style of combat. Just a blur of braids and hoofbeats, an arrow thudding into the sand beside you before you even hear the bowstring. And what about the silence afterward? That's where we find ourselves now. In the quiet space where bones whisper, I lived, where the wind across the burial mounds feels less like weather and more like memory. These warrior women were never trying to be legends. They were surviving, defending, leading, and eventually dying and being buried with the full honors of warriors. You take a slow breath this far into the night. The line between story and sleep gets soft. But here's what you carry forward. The Amazons may have started as a myth, but they refused to stay that way. They became real the moment the archaeologists stopped assuming women only carried combs and not curved blades. They became real when the bones told a different story than the textbooks. They became real when a girl with a bow was found where no one expected her to be. You shift gently beneath your blanket, heart slowing, mind wrapped now in something far older than dreams. The campfire is low now, little more than a circle of glowing embers in your imagination. Still, you stay close, watching those last curls of smoke rise up into the night. And through them, something shimmers. What if, just maybe, the Amazons had their own voice? Their own stories, never written down. This is the section where you lean in. The world gets quieter, and you finally listen not to the Greek poets or Hollywood scripts, but to the echoes of the women themselves, the ones who were never meant to be myth. Start here. Imagine a mother teaching her daughter how to string a bow. Fingers calloused, patient, firm, no nonsense. Maybe there's a chant they hum together to keep time. Maybe it's not a battlefield yet, maybe it's just a sunlit morning and a small figure learning to become dangerous. These women, real and fierce, must have had traditions, songs, inside jokes. One-liners shared before battle. We'll never know them exactly, of course, but let's play with a thought. If every culture tells stories, then the Amazons, if that's what we want to call them, must have told some too. And guess what? Some scholars believe we may have heard a few, just not in the way we expected. There are traces of female warrior deities across the ancient Eurasian region. In Central Asian folklore, you'll find goddesses of the hunt, of the steppe, of the moon, figures who ride alone, who fire arrows into the dark. Coincidence? Or memory passed down in disguise? Historians still argue whether these figures are directly inspired by Scythian women or whether we're projecting backward. Either way, it hints at a deeper truth. The idea of women who ride, who fight, who lead. It didn't die. It changed shape. Now here's something fun. In some Ossetian legends, descended from Scythian culture, there are warrior women called the Amazati. Not a Greek mispronunciation, this is their own name. Their stories are heroic and tragic and, yes, filled with betrayal, sacrifice, and arrows fired into the wind. These tales survived in oral tradition for over 2,000 years. That's not fantasy, that's cultural fossilization. We always say victors write history, but sometimes the defeated whisper it forward in lullabies, place names, and rituals that seem strange until you realize they're remnants of war paint and braided armor. So what else might these women have passed on? Maybe herbal knowledge. Some burial sites include bundles of medicinal plants. Lavender, wormwood, poppy pods, painkillers, maybe anti-inflammatories, or something more spiritual. A way to commune with ancestors or numb a searing wound. And what about that famous Amazon quirk, removing a breast to better shoot a bow? You've probably heard that, right? Well, here's the fringe fact. There's zero archaeological evidence to support it. No bones missing breast tissue attachment points. No medical instruments in graves. It's likely Greek propaganda, a dramatic flourish to make these women sound more alien, more other, more monstrous. Historians now believe it's symbolic, a kind of mythified exaggeration to suggest complete devotion to war, the truth. These women probably trained hard enough to shoot just fine with both breasts intact. Thank you very much. It's one of many myths we can toss into the metaphorical fire. Another, that they hated all men, also unlikely. Plenty of evidence suggests Scythian societies had gender flexibility, with women and men both fighting, both leading, both buried with honors. So the image of a no boys allowed warrior island is more Greek fanfiction than historical fact. Doesn't make it less cool, just less accurate. Still, the emotional core of the Amazon myth sticks with you. A world where women don't just survive in the shadows, but dominate in the open, where your worth is measured not by your smile, but by the strength of your stance, the sharpness of your aim, the loyalty you command. Imagine living like that. Or maybe you already do, in small ways. You carry your burdens like a shield. You move through hard days like they're uphill marches. You don't always wear armor, but you know how to brace yourself. That's modern Amazon energy. And just when you think you're finished hearing from them, you find out scientists are now reanalyzing old museum skeletons, once labeled male, and discovering yet many were actually female. Like, a lot. The myth wasn't a lie. It was a blind spot, one we're just beginning to correct. So maybe history's biggest Amazon trick wasn't the archery or the horseback raids, it was hiding in plain sight for centuries, behind misread bones and dusty assumptions. You're almost asleep now, drifting somewhere between fact and dream. But if you could ask one of those warrior women anything, what would it be? Maybe, what made you keep going? Or maybe, were you scared? Or simply, what was your name? We don't know. But we do know this, the Amazons, whatever you want to call them, left behind more than gold plaques and skeletons. They left behind a challenge to question what history says is possible. To rewrite the record, one arrow at a time. The air is soft now, everything's slowing down. That last arrow has flown, the hooves have faded into the earth, and the dust has long settled. All that's left is you, lying back in the quiet, listening to the final flickers of the story. And tonight, it ends not with a clash, but with a whisper. So let's rewind just a little. From a tangle of myth and exaggeration, you've followed a thread of truth stretching across 3,000 years, from Greek theatres to Scythian burial mounds, from Homer's smoky campfires to the Siberian ice tombs that froze time itself. Through it all, the Amazons have been hiding in plain sight, just not quite where anyone expected. And now, here in the 21st century, science finally catches up. With better tools, better questions, and a little less ego, modern archaeologists, many of them women themselves, are going back through old excavation records, re-examining remains, and realizing just how often women have been misclassified. You know that heroic warrior with a bronze dagger, a bow, and armor across the chest. That was a he for decades, until DNA said, nope, she. And we're not talking isolated cases. This is turning into a full-scale reassessment of ancient history, a slow, steady unveiling of all the warrior women who weren't allowed to be warriors on paper. Historians still argue whether this rewrite of the record will reshape our broader understanding of ancient gender roles, or if it'll just be a quirky footnote. But come on, you've walked through the ruins with us, felt the wind from the step, stared down the arrow tips. You know better. This isn't a footnote. It's a front-page rewrite. And it stretches farther than you might think. Across the Atlantic, in the Americas, evidence has surfaced of female warriors among indigenous tribes from the Comanche to the Haudenosaunee. In Africa, oral histories recall queens who led armies. In Southeast Asia, there were sword-wielding generals who commanded entire regions. The Amazon was never just a place. It was an idea, a signal fire, a defiant what if, whispered from continent to continent. And now, maybe, that whisper reaches you too. Not because you're heading into battle, hopefully not, but because something inside you recognizes the strength it took for those women to rise. Not once, but again and again, only to be forgotten, then unearthed, and remembered again. There's a quiet kind of awe in that. So as you close your eyes tonight, here's the final image, a vast plain under a star-blown sky. A young woman, alone, riding toward the horizon, her bow slung over her back, her horse breathing steam in the cool night air. She's not running from anything. She's not chasing a legend. She's the legend. And that's the real ending, isn't it? Not a death in battle. Not a moral handed down by a toga-wearing poet, but continuity. A line of power drawn in the dirt, picked up by the next hand, passed forward, woman to woman, like a secret name. You've met the myth. You've met the bones. And now somewhere in your own chest you carry a little piece of that flame. It's okay to let it burn slow and quiet. Legends don't always need to roar, so let your breathing slow. Let the stories coil themselves into dreams. You've followed the footsteps of the Amazons across history and imagination. And now, It's time to rest. Your mind, heavy now, floats across quiet plains and deeper shadows. The horses have stopped their gallop, the dust has settled on their tracks, the wind is soft and warm, curling through tall grasses and brushing over the resting mounds of forgotten warriors. Let the weight of armor slide from your shoulders. Let the bow drop from your fingers. You don't need to keep watch tonight. The stars overhead don't ask questions. They only shine just like they did for those riders so long ago, guiding them home or deeper into the unknown. The same sky, endless and unchanging, drapes over you now like a comforting cloak. Breathe in the stillness. No more raids. No more stories to unravel. No more forgotten bones needing voices. Just calm, just quiet, just you. And in that silence, maybe you hear it, the echo of a hoofbeat in the distance. Not loud, not urgent, just a reminder that something fierce once lived here, something wild, something real. And it never truly disappeared. It simply waited, so sleep easy. The journey is done. The legends are home. You're safe, you're warm, you're exactly where you need to be. And when morning comes, maybe the Amazons won't seem so far away.